The Gulag Archipelago Abridged, Part 4, The Soul and Barbed Wire. Behold, I shew you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. 1 Corinthians 15:51. Part 4, Chapter 1, The Ascent. And the years go by, not in swift staccato as they joke in camp, winter, summer, but in a long drawn-out autumn, an endless winter, an unwilling spring, and only a summer that is short. Even one mere year, whew, how long it lasts. Even in 1 year, how much time is left for you to think? For 365 days you stomp out to line up in a drizzling, slushy rain, and in a piercing blizzard, and in a biting and still sub-zero cold. For 365 days you work away at hateful alien work with your mind unoccupied. For 365 evenings you squinch up, wet, chilled, in the end of work line-up, waiting for the convoy to assemble from the distant watchtowers. And then there is the march out, and the march back, and the bending down over 730 bowls of gruel, over 730 portions of grits. Yes, and waking up and going to sleep on your multiple bunk, and neither radio nor books to distract you. There are none, and thank God. And that is only 1 year, and there are 10, there are 25. And then, too, when you are lying in the hospital with dystrophy, that, too, is a good time. To think. Think! Draw some conclusions from misfortune. And all that endless time, after all, the prisoners' brains and souls are not inactive? In the mass and from a distance they seem like swarming lice, but they are the crown of creation, right? After all, once upon a time a weak little spark of God was breathed into them too. Is it not true? So what has become of it now? For centuries it was considered that a criminal was given a sentence for precisely this purpose, to think about his crime for the whole period of his sentence, be conscience-stricken, repent, and gradually reform. But the Gulag Archipelago knows no pangs of conscience. Out of the 100 natives, 5 are thieves, and their transgressions are of no reproach in their own eyes, but a mark of valor. They dream of carrying out such feats in the future even more brazenly and cleverly. They have nothing to repent. Another 5 stole on a big scale, but not from people. In our times, the only place where one can steal on a big scale is from the state, which itself squanders the people's money without pity or sense. So what was there for such types to repent of? Maybe that they had not stolen more and divvied up, and thus remained free. And so as far as another 85% of the natives were concerned, they had never committed any crimes whatever. What were they supposed to repent of? That they had thought what they thought? No, not only do you not repent, but you clean your conscience. Like a clear mountain lake shines in your eyes. And your eyes, purified by suffering, infallibly perceive the least haze in other eyes. For example, they infallibly pick out the stool pigeons. And the Cheka GB is not aware of this capacity of ours to see with the eyes of truth. It is our secret weapon against that institution. It was in this nearly unanimous consciousness of our innocence that the main distinction arose between us and the hard-labor prisoners of Dostoevsky. There they were conscious of being doomed renegades, whereas we were confidently aware that they could haul in any free person at all in just the same way they had hauled us in. That barbed wire was only a nominal dividing line between us. In earlier times there had been among the majority the unconditional consciousness of personal guilt, and among us, the consciousness of disaster on a mammoth scale. Just to not perish from the disaster, it had to be survived. Wasn't this the root cause of the astounding rarity of camp suicides? Yes, rarity, although every ex-prisoner could in all probability recall a case of suicide, but he could recall even more escapes. There were certainly more escapes than suicides. Admirers of socialist realism can praise me. I am pursuing an optimistic line. And there were far more self-inflicted injuries, too, than there were suicides. But this, too, is an act indicating love of life. A straightforward calculation of sacrificing a portion to save the whole. I even imagine that, statistically speaking, there were fewer suicides per 1,000 of the population in camp than in freedom. I have no way of verifying this, of course. It is a very spectacular idea to imagine all the innocently outraged millions beginning to commit suicide in mass, causing double vexation to the government, both by demonstrating their innocence and by depriving the government of free manpower. And maybe the government would have had to soften up and begin to take pity on its subjects? Well, hardly. Stalin wouldn't have been stopped by that. He would have merely picked up another 20 million people from freedom. But it did not happen. People died by the hundreds of thousands and millions, driven, it would seem, to the extremity of extremities. But for some reason, there were no suicides. Condemned to a misshapen existence, to waste away from starvation, to exhaustion from labor, they did not put an end to themselves. And thinking the whole thing over, I found that proof to be the stronger. A suicide is always a bankrupt, always a human being in a blind alley, a human being who has gambled his life and lost, and is without the will to continue the struggle. If these millions of helpless and pitiful vermin still did not put an end to themselves, this meant some kind of invincible feeling was alive inside them, some very powerful idea. This was their feeling of universal innocence. It was the sense of an ordeal of the entire people, like a Tatar yoke. But what if one has nothing to repent of? What then? What then does the prisoner think about all the time? Poverty and prison give wisdom. They do. But where is it to be directed? Here is how it was with many others, not just with me. Our initial first prison sky consisted of black swirling storm clouds and black pillars of volcanic eruptions. This was the heaven of Pompeii, the heaven of the Day of Judgment, because it was not just anyone who had been arrested, but I, the center of this world. Our last prison sky was infinitely high, infinitely clear, even paler than sky blue. We all, except religious believers, began from one point. We tried to tear our hair from our head, but our hair had been clipped close. How could we have not seen those who informed against us? How could we have not seen our enemies? And how we hated them. How could we avenge ourselves on them? And what recklessness, what blindness, how many errors, how can they be corrected? They must be corrected all the more swiftly. We must write, we must speak out, we must communicate. But there is nothing that we can do, and nothing is going to save us. Then there begins the period of transit prisons. Interspersed with our thoughts about our future camp, we now love to recall our past. How well we used to live, even if we lived badly. But how many unused opportunities there were. When will we now make up for it? If I only manage to survive, oh, how differently, how wisely I am going to live. The day of our future release, it shines like a rising sun. And the conclusion is, survive to reach it. Survive at any price. This is simply a turn of phrase, a sort of habit of speech. At any price. But then the words swell up with their full meaning, and an awesome vow takes shape. To survive at any price. And whoever takes that vow, whoever does not blink before its crimson burst, allows his own misfortune to overshadow both the entire common misfortune and the whole world. This is the great fork of camp life. From this point the roads go to the right and to the left. One of them will rise and the other will descend. If you go to the right, you lose your life, and if you go to the left, you lose your conscience. One's own order to oneself, survive, is the natural splash of a living person. Who does not wish to survive? Who does not have the right to survive? straining all the strength of our body, an order to all our cells. Survive. A powerful charge is introduced into the chest cavity, and the heart is surrounded by an electrical cloud so as to not stop beating. They lead 30 emaciated but wirely Zaks 3 miles across the Arctic ice to a bathhouse. The bath is not worth even a warm word. 6 men at a time wash themselves in 5 shifts, and the door opens straight into the sub-zero temperature, and all 4 shifts are obliged to stand there before or after bathing, because they cannot be left without convoy, and not only does none of them get pneumonia, they don't even catch cold. And for 10 years one old man had his bath just like that, serving out his term from age 50 to 60. But then he was released. He was at home. Warm and cared for, he burned up in 1 month's time. That order, survive, was not there. But simply to survive does not yet mean at any price. At any price means at the price of someone else. Let us admit the truth. At that great fork in the camp road, at the great divider of souls, it was not the majority of the prisoners that turned to the right. Alas, not the majority, but fortunately neither was it just a few. There are many of them, human beings, who made this choice, but they did not shout about themselves. You had to look closely to see them. Dozens of times this same choice had arisen before them too, but they always knew, and they knew their own stand. Take Arnold Susi, who was sent to camp at the age of about 50. He had never been a believer, but he had always been fundamentally decent. He had never led any other kind of life, and he was not about to begin any other. He was a Westerner, and what that meant was that he was doubly unprepared, and kept putting his foot into it all the time, and getting into serious difficulties. He worked at general work, and he was imprisoned in a penalty camp, and he still managed to survive. He survived exactly the same kind of person he had been when he came to camp. I knew him at the very beginning, and I knew him afterward, and I can testify personally. True, there were 3 seriously mitigating circumstances which accompanied him throughout his camp life. He was classified as an invalid. For several years he received parcels, and thanks to his musical abilities, he got some additional nourishment out of amateur theatricals. But these 3 circumstances only explain why he survived. If they had not existed, he would have died. But he would not have changed, and perhaps those who died did die because they did not change. And Tereshkovic, a perfectly ordinary, straightforward person, recalls, "There were many prisoners prepared to grovel for a bread ration or a puff of makorka smoke. I was dying, but I kept my soul pure. I always called a spade a spade." It has been known for many centuries that prison causes the profound rebirth of a human being. The examples are innumerable, such as that of Silvio Pellico. Through serving 8 years, he was transformed from a furious Carbonero to a meek Roman Catholic. In our country, they always mention Dostoevsky in this respect. These transformations always proceed in the direction of deepening the soul. Ibsen wrote, "From lack of oxygen, even the conscience will wither." By no means, it is by not any means so simple. In fact, it is the opposite. Take General Gorbatov. He had fought from his very youth, advanced through the ranks of the army, and at no time at all in which to think about things. But he was imprisoned, and how good it was. Various events awakened within his recollection, such as his having suspected an innocent man of espionage, or having ordered by mistake the execution of a quite innocent Pole. Well, when else would he have remembered this? After rehabilitation, he did not remember such things very much. Enough has been written about prisoners' changes of heart to raise it to the level of penological theory. For example, in the pre-revolutionary Prison Herald, Lukanetsky wrote, "Darkness renders a person more sensitive to light. Involuntary inactivity imprisonment arouses in him a thirst for life, movement, work. The quiet compels profound pondering over his own I, over surrounding conditions, over his past and present, and forces him to think about his future. Our teachers, who had never served time themselves, felt for the prisoners only the natural sympathy of the outsider. Dostoevsky, however, who served time himself, was a proponent of punishment, and this was something worth thinking about. The proverb says, "Freedom spoils, and lack of freedom teaches." But Pellico and Lukyanetsky wrote about prison, but Dostoevsky demanded punishment in prison. But what kind of lack of freedom is it that educates? Camp? That is something to think about. Of course, they were not concerned with our souls when they pumped up the archipelago, but nonetheless, is it really hopeless to stand fast in camp? And more than that, was it really impossible for one's soul to rise in camp? Here is E.K., who was born around 1940, one of those boys who, under Khrushchev, gathered to read poems on Mayakovsky Square, but were hauled off instead in Black Marias. From a Patma camp, he writes to his girl, "Here all the trivia and fuss have decreased. I have experienced a turning point. Here you hearken to that voice deep inside you, which amid the surfeit and vanity used to be stifled by the roar from outside." At the Samarkand camp in 1946, a group of intellectuals had reached the very brink of death. They were worn down by hunger, cold, and work beyond their powers, and they were even deprived of sleep. They had nowhere to lie down. Dugout barracks had not yet been built. Did they go and steal, or squeal, or whimper about their ruined lives? No. Foreseeing the approach of death in days rather than weeks, here is how they spent their last sleepless leisure, sitting up against the wall. Timofeyev Rozovsky gathered them into a seminar, and they hastened to share with one another what one of them knew and the others did not. They delivered their last lectures to each other. Father Savelli spoke of unshameful death, a priest academician about patristics, one of the Uniate Fathers, about something in the area of dogmatics and canonical writings, an electrical engineer on the principles of energetics of the future, and a Leningrad economist on how the effort to create principles of Soviet economics had failed for the lack of new ideas. Timofeyev Rozovsky himself talked about the principles of microphysics. From one session to the next, participants were missing. They were already in the morgue. That is the sort of person who can be interested in all this while already growing numb with approaching death. Now that is an intellectual. Pardon me, you love life? You who exclaim and sing over and over and dance it too. I love you, life. Oh, I love you, life. Do you? Well, go on. Love it. Camp life. Love that too. It, too, is life. There where there's no struggle with fate, there you will resurrect your soul. You haven't understood a thing. When you get there, you'll collapse. Along our chosen road are twists and turns and twists and turns. Uphill or up into the heavens. Let's go, let's stumble and stagger. The day of liberation, what can it give us after so many years? We will change unrecognizably, and so will our near and dear ones, and places which were once dear to us will seem stranger than strange, and the thought of freedom after a time even becomes a forced thought, far-fetched, strange. The day of liberation, as if there were any liberty in this country, or as if it were possible to liberate anyone who has not first become liberated in his own soul. The stones roll down from under our feet, downward into the past. They are the ashes of the past, and we ascend. It is a good thing to think in prison, but it is not bad in camp either, because, and this is the main thing, there are no meetings. For 10 years you are free from all kinds of meetings. Is that not mountain air? While they openly claim your labor and your body to the point of exhaustion and even death, the camp keepers do not encroach at all on your thoughts. They do not try to screw down your brains and to fasten them in place, and this results in a sensation of freedom of much greater magnitude than the freedom of one's feet to run along on the level. No one tries to persuade you to apply for party membership. No one comes around to squeeze membership dues out of you in voluntary societies. There is no trade union, the same kind of protector of your interests as an official lawyer before a tribunal. And there are no production meetings. You cannot be elected to any position. You cannot be appointed some kind of delegate. And the really important thing is that they cannot compel you to be a propagandist, nor to listen to propaganda, nor will they ever drag you off to the electoral precinct to vote freely and secretly for a single candidate. No one requires any socialist undertakings of you, nor self-criticism of your mistakes, nor articles in the wall newspaper, nor an interview with a provincial correspondent. A free head. Now is that not an advantage of life in the archipelago? And there is one more freedom. No one can deprive you of your family and property. You have already been deprived of them. And what does not exist, not even God can take away, and this is a basic freedom. It is good to think in imprisonment, and the most insignificant cause gives you a push in the direction of extended and important thoughts. Once in a long, long while, once in 3 years maybe, they brought a movie to camp. The film turned out to be the cheapest kind of sports comedy. It was a bore. But from the screen they kept drumming into the audience the moral of the film. The result is what counts, and the result is not in your favor. On the screen they kept laughing. In the hall the audience kept laughing too. But blinking as you came out into the sunlit camp yard, you kept thinking about this phrase. And during the evening you kept thinking about it on your bunk, and Monday morning out in lineup. And you could keep thinking about it as long as you wanted. And where else could you have concentrated on it like that? And slow clarity descended into your brain. This was no joke. This was an infectious thought. It has long since been inculcated into our fatherland. And they keep on inculcating it over and over. The concept that only the material result counts has become so much a part of us that when, for example, some Tukhachevsky, Yagoda, or Zinoviev was proclaimed a traitor who had sidled up to the enemy, people only exclaimed in a chorus of astonishment, "What more could he want?" Now that is a high moral plane for you. Now that is a real unit of measure for you. What more could he want? Since he had a belly full of chow, and 20 suits, and 2 country homes, and an automobile, and an airplane, and fame, what more could he want? Millions of our compatriots find it unthinkable to imagine that a human being, and I am not speaking here of this particular trio, might have been motivated by something other than material gain. To such an extent has everyone been indoctrinated with and absorbed the slogan, "The result is what counts." Whence did this come to us? If we look back at our history, maybe about 300 years, could anything of the kind have taken place in the Russia of old believers? All this came to us from Peter I, from the glory of our banners and from the so-called honor of our fatherland. We were crushing our neighbors, we were expanding, and in our fatherland it became well established that the result is what counts. And then from our Demidovs, Kabans, and Saibukins, they clambered up, without looking behind them to see whose ears they were smashing with their jackboots, and ever more firmly it became established among a once pious and open-hearted people. The result is what counts. And then, from all kinds of socialists, and most of all from the most modern, infallible, and intolerant teaching, which consists of this one thing only, the result is what counts. It is important to forge a fighting party, and to seize power, and to hold on to power, and to remove all enemies, and to conquer in pig iron and steel, and to launch rockets. And though for this industry and for these rockets it was necessary to sacrifice the way of life, and the integrity of the family, and the spiritual health of the people, and the very soul of our fields and forests and rivers, to hell with them, the result is what counts. But that is a lie. Here we have been breaking our backs for years at all union hard labor, Here in slow annual spirals we have been climbing up to an understanding of life, and from this height it can all be seen so clearly. It is not the result that counts. It is not the result, but the spirit. Not what, but how. Not what has been attained, but at what price. And so it is with us the prisoners. If it is the result which counts, then it is also true that one must survive at any price, and what that means is, one must become a stool pigeon, betray one's comrades, and thereby get oneself set up comfortably, and perhaps even get time off sentence. In the light of the infallible teaching, there is, evidently, nothing reprehensible in this. After all, if one does that, then the result will be in our favor, and the result is what counts. No one is going to argue. It is pleasant to win, but not at the price of losing one's human countenance. If it is the result which counts, you must strain every nerve and sinew to avoid general work. You must bend down, be servile, act meanly, yet hang on to your position as a trustee. And by this means survive. And by this means survive. If it is the essence that counts, then the time has come to reconcile yourself to general work, to tatters, to torn skin on the hands, to a piece of bread which is smaller and worse, and perhaps to death. You drag your way along proudly with an aching back, and that is when you have ceased to be afraid of threats and are not chasing after rewards, you become the most dangerous character in the owl-like view of the bosses, because what hold do they have on you? And as soon as you have renounced that aim of surviving at any price, and gone where the calm and simple people go, then imprisonment begins to transform your former character in an astonishing way, to transform it in a direction most unexpected to you. And it would seem that in this situation feelings of malice, the disturbance of being oppressed, aimless hate, irritability, and nervousness ought to multiply. But you yourself do not notice how, with the impalpable flow of time, slavery nurtures in you the shoots of contradictory feelings. Once upon a time you were sharply intolerant. You were constantly in a rush, and you were constantly short of time, and now you have time with interest. You are surfeited with it, with its months and its years behind you and ahead of you, and a beneficial calming fluid pours through your blood vessels. Patience. You are ascending. Formerly you never forgave anyone. You judged people without mercy, and you praised people with equal lack of moderation. And now an understanding mildness has become the basis of your uncategorical judgments. You have come to realize your own weakness, and you can therefore understand the weakness of others, and be astonished at another's strength, and wish to possess it yourself. The stones rustle beneath our feet. We are ascending. With the years, armor-plated restraint covers your heart and all your skin. You do not hasten to question, and you do not hasten to power. Your tongue has lost its flexible capacity for easy oscillation. Your eyes do not flash with gladness over good tidings, nor do they darken with grief. For you still have to verify whether that's how it is going to be, and you also have to work out what is gladness and what is grief. And now the rule of your life is this: do not rejoice when you have found, do not weep when you have lost. Your soul, which formerly was dry, now ripens from suffering, and even if you haven't come to love your neighbors in the Christian sense, you are at least learning to love those close to you in spirit who surround you in slavery. And how many of us come to realize it is particularly in slavery that for the first time we have learned to recognize genuine friendship, and also those close to you in blood, who surrounded you in your former life, who loved you, while you played the tyrant over them. Here is a rewarding and inexhaustible direction for your thoughts. Reconsider all your previous life. Remember everything you did that was bad and shameful, and take thought. Can't you possibly correct it now? Yes, you have been imprisoned for nothing. You have nothing to repent of before the state and its laws. But before your own conscience? But in relation to other individuals? Following an operation, I am lying in the surgical ward of a camp hospital. I cannot move. I am hot and feverish, but nonetheless my thoughts do not dissolve into delirium, and I am grateful to Dr. Boris Nikolaevich Kornfeld, who is sitting beside my cot and talking to me all evening. The light has been turned out, so it will not hurt my eyes. He and I, and there is no one else in the ward. Fervently he tells me the long story of his conversion from Judaism to Christianity. This conversion was accomplished by an educated, cultivated person, one of his cellmates, some good-natured old fellow like Platon Karatayev. I am astonished at the conviction of the new convert, at the ardor of his words. We know each other very slightly, and he was not the one responsible for my treatment, but there was simply no one here with whom he could share his feelings. He was a gentle and well-mannered person. It is already late. All the hospital is asleep. Kornfeld is ending up his story thus. And on the whole, do you know, I have become convinced that there is no punishment that comes to us in this life on earth which is undeserved. Superficially, it can have nothing to do with what we are guilty of in actual fact, but if you go over your life with a fine-tooth comb and ponder it deeply, you will always be able to hunt down that transgression of yours for which you have now received this blow. I cannot see his face. Through the window come only the scattered reflections of the lights of the perimeter outside, and the door from the corridor gleams in a yellow electrical glow. But there is such mystical knowledge in his voice that I shudder. These were the last words of Boris Kornfeld. Noiselessly he went out into the nighttime corridor and into one of the nearby wards, and there lay down to sleep. Everyone slept, and there was no one with whom he could speak even one word. And I went off to sleep myself. And I was wakened in the morning by running about and tramping in the corridor. The orderlies were carrying Kornfeld's body to the operating room. He had been dealt 8 blows on the skull with a plasterer's mallet while he still slept. In our camp it was the custom to kill immediately after rising time, when the barracks were all unlocked and open, and when no one had yet got up, when no one was stirring. And he died on the operating table without regaining consciousness. And so it happened that Kornfeld's prophetic words were his last words on earth, and, directed to me, they lay upon me as an inheritance. You cannot brush off that kind of inheritance by shrugging your shoulders. But by that time I myself had matured to similar thoughts. I would have been inclined to endow his words with the significance of a universal law of life. However, one can get all tangled up that way. One would have to admit that on that basis those who had been punished even more cruelly than with prison, those shot, burned at the stake, were some sort of super evildoers. And yet, the innocent are those who get punished most zealously of all. And what would one have to say about our so evident torturers? Why does not fate punish them? Why do they prosper? And the only solution to this would be that the meaning of earthly existence lies not, as we have grown used to thinking, in prospering, but in the development of the soul. From that point of view, our torturers have been punished most horribly of all. They are turning into swine. They are departing downward from humanity. From that point of view, punishment is inflicted on those whose development holds out hope. But there was something else in Kornfeld's last words that touched a sensitive chord, and that I accept quite completely for myself, and many will accept the same for themselves. In the 7th year of my imprisonment, I had gone over and re-examined my life quite enough, and had come to understand why everything had happened to me, both prison and, as an additional piece of my ballast, my malignant tumor. And I would not have murmured even if all that punishment had been considered inadequate. Punishment, but whose? Well, just think about that. Whose? I lay there a long time in that recovery room from which Kornfeld had gone forth to his death, and all alone during sleepless nights I pondered with astonishment my own life and the turns it had taken. In accordance with my established camp custom, I set down my thoughts in rhymed verses so as to remember them, and the most accurate thing is to cite them here, just as they came from the pillow of a hospital patient, when the hard labor camp was still shuddering outside the windows in the wake of a revolt. When was it that I completely scattered the good seeds, one and all? For after all I spent my boyhood in the bright singing of thy temples. Bookish subtleties sparked brightly, piercing my arrogant brain. The secrets of the world were in my grasp, life's destiny, as pliable as wax. Blood seethed, and every swirl gleamed iridescently before me. Without a tumble, the building of my faith quietly crumbled within my heart, but passing here between being and nothingness, stumbling and clutching at the edge, I look behind me with a grateful tremor upon the life that I have lived. Not with good judgment nor with desire are its twists and turns illumined, but with the even glow of the higher meaning, which became apparent to me only later on. And now, with measuring cup returned to me, scooping up the living water, God of the universe, I believe again. Though I renounced you, you were with me. Looking back, I saw that for my whole conscious life I had not understood either myself or my strivings. What had seemed for so long to be beneficial now turned out in actuality to be fatal, and I had been striving to go in the opposite direction to that which was truly necessary to me. But just as the waves of the sea knock the inexperienced swimmer off his feet and keep tossing him back onto the shore, so also was I painfully tossed back on dry land by the blows of misfortune. And it was only because of this that I was able to travel the path which I had always really wanted to travel. It was granted to me to carry away from my prison years on my bent back, which nearly broke beneath its load, this essential experience: how a human becomes evil, and how good. In the intoxication of youthful successes I had felt myself to be infallible, and I was therefore cruel. In the surfeit of power I was a murderer and an oppressor. In my most evil moments I was convinced that I was doing good, and I was well supplied with systematic arguments. And it was only when I lay there on rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us it oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained, and even in the best of all hearts there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil. Since then I have come to understand the truth of all the religions of the world. They struggle with the evil inside a human being, inside every human being. It is impossible to expel evil from the world in its entirety, but it is possible to constrict it within each person. And since that time I have come to understand the falsehood of all the revolutions in history. They destroy only those carriers of evil contemporary with them, and also fail, out of haste, to discriminate the carriers of good as well. And they then take to themselves as their heritage the actual evil itself, magnified still more. The Nuremberg trials have to be regarded as one of the special achievements of the 20th century. They killed the very idea of evil, though they killed very few of the people who had been infected with it. Of course, Stalin deserves no credit here. He would have preferred to explain less and shoot more. And if by the 21st century humanity has not yet blown itself up and has not suffocated itself, perhaps it is this direction that will triumph? Yes, and if it does not triumph, then all humanity's history will have turned out to be an empty exercise in marking time, without the tiniest mite of meaning. Whither and to what end will we otherwise be moving? To beat the enemy over the head with a club. Even cavemen knew that. Know thyself. There is nothing that so aids and assists the awakening of omniscience within us as insistent thoughts about one's own transgressions, errors, mistakes. After the difficult cycles of such ponderings over many years, whenever I mentioned the heartlessness of our highest-ranking bureaucrats, the cruelty of our executioners, I remember myself and my captain's shoulder boards and the forward march of my battery through East Prussia, enshrouded in fire, and I say, so were we any better? When people express vexation, in my presence, over the West's tendency to crumble, its political short-sightedness, its divisiveness, its confusion, I recall too. Were we, before passing through the archipelago, more steadfast, firmer in our thoughts? And that is why I turn back to the years of my imprisonment and say, sometimes to the astonishment of those about me, bless you, prison. Lev Tolstoy was right when he dreamed of being put in prison. At a current moment, that giant began to dry up. He actually needed prison as a drought needs a shower of rain. All the writers who wrote about prison, but who did not themselves serve time there, considered it their duty to express sympathy for prisoners and to curse prison. I have served enough time there. I nourished my soul there, and I say without hesitation, bless you, prison, for having been in my life. And from beyond the grave come replies, it is very well for you to say that, when you came out of it alive. End of Part 4, Chapter 1. Part 4, Chapter 2, or Corruption. But I have been brought up short. You are not talking about the subject at all. You have got off the track again and on to prison, and what you are supposed to be talking about is camp. But I was also, I thought, talking about camp. Well, all right, I'll shut up. I shall give some space to contrary opinions. Many camp inmates will object to what I have said, and will say that they did not observe any ascent of the soul, that this is nonsense, and that corruption took place at every step. More insistent and more significant than others, because he had already written about this, was Shelemov's objection. In the camp situation, human beings never remain human beings. The camps were created to this end. All human emotions, love, friendship, envy, love of one's fellows, mercy, thirst for fame, honesty, fell away from us along with the meat of our muscles. We had no pride, no vanity, and even jealousy and passion seemed to be Martian concepts. The only thing left was anger, the most enduring of human emotions. We came to understand that truth and falsehood were kin sisters. There is only one distinction here to which Shelemov agrees. Ascent, growth in profundity, the development of human beings, is possible in prison. But camp is wholly and consistently a negative school of life. There is nothing either necessary or useful that anyone derives from it. The prisoner learns flattery, falsehood, and petty and large-scale meanness. When he returns home, he sees not only that he has grown during his time in camp, but that his interests have become meager and crude. Y. Ginsberg also agrees with this distinction. Prison ennobled people, while camp corrupted them. And how can one object to that? In prison, both in solitary confinement and outside solitary too, a human being confronts his grief face to face. This grief is a mountain, but he has to find space inside himself for it, to familiarize himself with it, to digest it, and it him. This is the highest form of moral effort, which has always ennobled every human being. A duel with the years and with the walls constitutes moral work and a path upward, if you can climb it. And if you share those years with a comrade, it is never in a situation in which you are called on to die in order to save his life, nor is it necessary for him to die in order for you to survive. You had the possibility of entering not into conflict, but into mutual support and enrichment. But in camp, it would appear, you do not have that path. Bread is not issued in equal pieces, but thrown onto a pile. Go grab. Knock down your neighbors and tear it out of their hands. The quantity of bread issued is such that 1 or 2 people have to die for each who survives. The bread is hung up high on a pine tree. Go fell it. The bread is deposited in a coal mine. Go down and mine it. Can you think about your own grief, about the past and the future, about humanity and God? Your mind is absorbed in vain calculations which for the present moment cut you off from the heavens. And tomorrow you are worth nothing. You hate labor. It is your principal enemy. You hate your companions, rivals in life and death. You are reduced to a frazzle by intense envy and alarm, lest somewhere behind your back others right now dividing up that bread which could be yours, that somewhere on the other side of the wall a tiny potato is being ladled out of the pot which could have ended up in your own bowl. Camp life was organized in such a way that envy pecked at your soul from all sides, even the best defended soul. And in addition, you are constantly gripped by fear of slipping off even though that pitifully low level to which you are clinging, of losing your work, which is still not the hardest, of becoming a cropper on a prisoner transport, of ending up in a strict regimen camp. And on top of that, you got beaten if you were weaker than all the rest, or else you yourself beat up those weaker than you. And wasn't this corruption? Soul mange is what A. Rubailo, an old camp veteran, called this swift decay under external pressure. Amid these vicious feelings and tense petty calculations, when and on what foundation could you ascend? So isn't it the right time not to object, and not to rise to the defense of some sort of alleged camp ascent, but to describe hundreds, thousands of cases of genuine soul corruption? To cite examples of how no one could resist the camp philosophy of Yashka, the Jez-Kazgan work assigner, the more you spit on people, the more they'll esteem you. To tell how newly arrived frontline soldiers, in Krasleg in 1942, had no sooner scented the thieves' atmosphere than they themselves undertook to play the thief, to plunder the Lithuanians and to fatten up off their foodstuffs and possessions. You greenhorns can go die. Or how certain Vlasov men began to pass for thieves out of the conviction that that was the only way to survive in camp. Or about that assistant professor of literature who became a thief ringleader. And how much corruption was introduced by that democratic and progressive system of trusty watchmen, which our Zek terminology became converted to self-guarding, introduced back in 1918. After all, this was one of the mainstreams of camp corruption, the enlistment of prisoners in the trusty guards. He grows proud. And he tightens his grip on his gun stock. And he shoots. And he is even more severe than the free guards. How is one to understand this? Was it really a purblind faith in social initiative? Or was it just an icy, contemptuous calculation based on the lowest human feelings? After all, it was not just a matter of self-guarding either. There were also self-supervision and self-oppression, right up to the situation in the 30s when all of them, all the way up to the camp chief, were Zeks, including the transport chief, the production chief. Yes, and even security chiefs were Zeks too. One could not have carried self-supervision any further than that. The Zeks were conducting interrogations of themselves. They were recruiting stool pigeons to denounce themselves. Yes, but I am not going to examine those countless cases of corruption here. They are well known to everyone. They have already been described, and they will be described again. It is quite enough to admit they took place. This is the general trend. This is as it should be. Why repeat about each and every house in that sub-zero weather? It loses its warmth. It is much more surprising to note that there are houses which retain their warmth even in sub-zero weather. And how is it that genuine religious believers survived in camp, as we have mentioned more than once? In the course of this book, we have already mentioned their self-confident procession through the archipelago, a sort of silent religious procession with invisible candles, how some of them were mowed down by machine guns and those next in line continued their march, a steadfastness unheard of in the 20th century. And it was not in the least for show, and there weren't any declamations. Take some Aunt Dussia Camille, a round-faced, calm, and quite illiterate old woman. The convoy guards called out to her, "Camille, what is your article?" And she gently, good-naturedly replied, "Why are you asking, my boy? It's all written down there. I can't remember them all." She had a bouquet of sections under Article 58. "Your term." Auntie Dussia sighed. She wasn't giving such contradictory answers in order to annoy the convoy. In her own simple-hearted way, she pondered this question. Her term? Did they really think it was given to human beings to know their terms? What term? Till God forgives my sins. Till then I'll be serving time. You are a silly, a silly, the convoy guards laughed. 15 years you've got, and you'll serve them all, and maybe some more besides. But after 2.5 years of her term had passed, even though she had sent no petitions, all of a sudden a piece of paper came. Release. How could one not envy those people? Were circumstances more favorable for them? By no means. It is a well-known fact that the nuns were kept only with prostitutes and thieves at penalty camps. And yet who was there among the religious believers whose soul was corrupted? They died, most certainly. But they were not corrupted. And how can one explain that certain unstable people found faith right there in camp, that they were strengthened by it, and that they survived uncorrupted, and many more, scattered about and unnoticed, came to their allotted turning point and made no mistake in their choice? Those who managed to see that things were not only bad for them, but even worse, even harder, for their neighbors. And all those who, under the threat of penalty zone and a new term of imprisonment, refused to become stoolies. How, in general, can one explain Grigory Ivanovich Grigoriev, a soil scientist? A scientist who volunteered for the People's Volunteer Corps in 1941, and the rest of the story is a familiar one. Taken prisoner near Vyazma, he spent his whole captivity in a German camp, and the subsequent story is also familiar. When he returned, he was arrested by us and given a tenner. I came to know him in winter, engaged in general work in Ekibistas. His forthrightness gleamed from his big, quiet eyes, some sort of unwavering forthrightness. This man was never able to bow in spirit, and he didn't bow in camp either, even though he worked only 2 of his 10 years in his own field of specialization, and didn't receive food parcels from home for nearly the whole term. He was subjected on all sides to the camp philosophy, to the camp corruption of the soul, but he was incapable of adopting it. In the Kemerovo camps, Antibes, the security chief kept trying to recruit him as a stoolie. Grigoriev replied to him quite honestly and candidly, "I find it repulsive to talk to you. You will find many willing without me. You bastard, you'll crawl on all 4s. I would be better off hanging myself on the first branch." And so he was sent off to a penalty situation. He stood it for half a year, and he made mistakes which were even more unforgivable. When he was sent on an agricultural work party, he refused, as a soil scientist, to accept the post of brigadier offered to him. He hoed and scythed with enthusiasm, and even more stupidly, in Ekibistas, at the stone quarry, he refused to be a work checker, only because he would have had to pad the worksheets for the sluggers, for which, later on, when they caught up with it, the eternally drunk free foreman would have had to pay the penalty. But would he? And so he went to break rocks. His honesty was so monstrously unnatural that when he went out to process potatoes with the vegetable storeroom brigade, he did not steal any, though everyone else did. When he was in a good post, in the privileged repair shop brigade at the pumping station equipment, he left simply because he refused to wash the socks of the free bachelor construction supervisor, Trevish. His fellow brigade members tried to persuade him. Come on now, isn't it all the same, the kind of work you do? But no, it turned out it was not at all the same to him. How many times did he select the worst and hardest lot, just so as not to have to offend against conscience? And he didn't, not in the least, and I am a witness. And even more, because of the astounding influence on his body of his bright and spotless human spirit, though no one today believes in any such influence, no one understands it. The organism of Grigory Ivanovich, who was no longer young, close to 50, grew stronger in camp. His earlier rheumatism of one of the joints disappeared completely, and he became particularly healthy after the typhus from which he recovered. In the winter he went out in cotton sacks, making holes for them in his head and his arms, and he did not catch cold. So wouldn't it be more correct to say that no camp can corrupt those who have a stable nucleus, who do not accept that pitiful ideology which holds that human beings are created for happiness, an ideology which is done in by the first blow of the work assigner's cudgel? Those people became corrupted in camp who before camp had not been enriched by any morality at all, or by any spiritual upbringing. This is not at all a theoretical matter, since during our glorious half-century millions of them grew up. Those people became corrupted in camp who had already been corrupted out in freedom, or who were ready for it, because people are corrupted in freedom too, sometimes even more effectively than in camp. If a person went swiftly bad in camp, what it might mean was that he had not just gone bad, but that inner foulness which had not previously been needed had disclosed itself. M.A. Voitchenko has his opinion. In camp, existence did not determine consciousness, but just the opposite. Consciousness and steadfast faith in the human essence decided whether you became an animal or remained a human being. Yes, camp corruption was a mass phenomenon, but not only because the camps were awful, but because, in addition, we Soviet people stepped upon the soil of the archipelago spiritually disarmed, long since prepared to be corrupted, already tinged by it out in freedom, and we strained our ears to hear it from the old camp veterans, how to live in camp. But we ought to have known how to live, and how to die, without any camp. Yes, the camps were calculated and intended to corrupt, but this didn't mean that they succeeded in crushing everyone. Just as in nature, the process of oxidation never occurs without an accompanying reduction. One substance oxidizes while at the same time another reduces. So in camp, too, and everywhere in life, there is no corruption without ascent. They exist alongside one another. In the next part, I hope still to show how in other camps, in the special camps, a different environment was created after a certain time. The process of corruption was greatly hampered, and the process of ascent became attractive even to the camp careerists. End of Part 4, Chapter 2. Part 4, Chapter 3. Our Muzzled Freedom. But even when all the main things about the Gulag Archipelago are written, read, and understood, will there be anyone, even then, who grasps what our freedom was like? What sort of a country it was that for whole decades dragged that archipelago about inside itself? It was my fate to carry inside me a tumor the size of a large man's fist. This tumor swelled and distorted my stomach, hindered my eating and sleeping, and I was always conscious of it, though it did not constitute even 0.5% of my body, whereas within the country as a whole the archipelago constituted 8%. But the horrifying thing was not that this tumor pressed upon and displaced adjacent organs. What was most terrifying about it was that it exuded poisons and infected the whole body. And in this same way our whole country was infected by the poisons of the archipelago. And whether it will be able to get rid of them someday, only God knows. Can we, dare we, describe the full loathsomeness of the state in which we lived, not so remote from that of today? And if we do not show that loathsomeness in its entirety, then we at once have a lie. For this reason, I consider that literature did not exist in our country in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, because without the full truth, it is not literature. And today they show this loathsomeness according to the fashion of the moment, by inference, and inserted phrase, an afterthought, or hint, and the result is again a lie. This is not the task of our book, but let us try to enumerate briefly those traits of free life which were determined by the closeness of the archipelago, or which were in the same style. 1. Constant fear. As the reader has already seen, the roster of the waves of recruitment into the archipelago is not exhausted with 1935, or 1937, or 1949. The recruitment went on all the time. Just as there is no minute when people are not dying or being born, so there was no minute when people were not being arrested. Sometimes this came close to a person, sometimes it was further off. Sometimes a person deceived himself into thinking that nothing threatened him, and sometimes he himself became an executioner, and thus the threat to him diminished. But any adult inhabitant of this country, from a collective farmer up to a member of the Politburo, always knew that it would only take one careless word or gesture and he would fly off irrevocably into the abyss. Just as the archipelago beneath every trustee lay the chasm, and death, of general work, so beneath every inhabitant lay the chasm, and death, of the archipelago. In appearance, the country was much bigger than its archipelago, but all of it and its inhabitants hung phantom-like above the latter's gaping maw. Fear was not always the fear of arrest. There were intermediate threats, purges, inspections, the completion of security questionnaires, routine or extraordinary ones, dismissal from work, deprivation of residence permit, expulsion or exile. The security questionnaires were so detailed and so inquisitive that more than half the inhabitants of the country had a bad conscience and were constantly and permanently tormented by the approach of the period when they had to be filled out. Once people had invented a false life story for these questionnaires, they had to try to not get tangled up in it. The aggregate fear led to a correct consciousness of one's own insignificance and of the lack of any kind of rights. Nadezhda Mandelstam speaks truly when she remarks that our life is so permeated with prison that simple meaningful words like "they took," or "they put inside," or "he is inside," or "they let out," are understood by everyone in our country in only one sense, even without a context. Peace of mind is something our citizens have never known. 2. Servitude. If it had been easy to change your place of residence, to leave a place that had become dangerous for you and thus shake off fear and refresh yourself, people would have behaved more boldly, and they might have taken some risks. But for long decades we were shackled by that same system under which no worker could quit of his own accord, and the passport regulations also fastened everyone to particular places, and the housing, which could not be sold, nor exchanged, nor rented. And because of this, it was an insane piece of daring to protest in the place where you lived or worked. 3. Secrecy and mistrust. These feelings replaced our former open-hearted cordiality and hospitality, which had still not been destroyed in the 20s. These feelings were the natural defense of any family and every person, particularly because no one could ever quit work or leave, and every little detail was kept in sight and within earshot for years. The secretiveness of the Soviet person is by no means superfluous, but it is absolutely necessary, even though to a foreigner it may at times seem superhuman. The former Tsarist officer K.U. survived and was never arrested only because when he got married, he did not tell his wife. about his past. His brother, N.U., was arrested, and the wife of the arrested man, taking advantage of the fact that they lived in different cities at the time of his arrest, hid his arrest from her own father and mother, so they would not blurt it out. She preferred telling them and everyone else that her husband had abandoned her, and then playing that role a long time. Now these were the secrets of one family which I was told 30 years later, and what urban family did not have such secrets? 4. Universal ignorance. Hiding things from each other and not trusting each other, we ourselves helped implement that absolute secrecy, absolute misinformation, among us which was the cause of causes of everything that took place, including both millions of arrests and the mass approval of them also. Informing one another of nothing, neither shouting nor groaning, and learning nothing from one another, we were completely in the hands of the newspapers and the official orators. 5. Squealing was developed to a mind-boggling extent. Hundreds of thousands of security officers in their official offices, in the innocent rooms of official buildings, and in pre-arranged apartments, sparing neither paper nor their unoccupied time, tirelessly recruited and summoned stool pigeons to give reports, and this in such enormous numbers as they could never have found necessary for collecting information. One of the purposes of such extensive recruitment was, evidently, to make each subject feel the breath of the stool pigeons on his own skin, so that in every group of people, in every office, in every apartment, either there would be an informer, or else the people would be afraid there was. I will give my own superficial speculative estimate. Out of every 4 to 5 city dwellers, there would most certainly be one who at least once in his life had received a proposal to become an informer, and it might even have been more widespread than that. Quite recently I carried out my own spot check, both among groups of ex-prisoners and among groups of those who have always been free. I asked which out of the group they had tried to recruit, and when and how. And it turned out that out of the several people at a table, all had received such proposals at one time or another. Nadezhda Mandelstam correctly concludes, beyond the purpose of weakening ties between people, there was another purpose as well. Any person who had let himself be recruited would, out of fear of public exposure, be very much interested in the continuing stability of the regime. 6. Betrayal as a form of existence. Given this constant fear over a period of many years, for one's self and one's family, a human being became a vassal of fear, subjected to it, and it turned out that the least dangerous form of existence was constant betrayal. The mildest and at the same time most widespread form of betrayal was to not do anything bad directly, but just to not notice the doomed person next to one, not to help him, to turn away one's face, to shrink back. They had arrested a neighbor, your comrade at work, or even your close friend. You kept silence. You acted as if you had not noticed, for you could not afford to lose your current job. And then it was announced at work, at the general meeting, that the person who had disappeared the day before was an inveterate enemy of the people. And you, who had bent your back beside him for 20 years at the same desk, now by your noble silence, or even by your condemning speech, had to show how hostile you were to his crimes. You had to make this sacrifice for the sake of your own dear family, for your own dear ones. What right had you not to think about them? A mother, children, and perhaps they at least ought to be helped? No, that would be dangerous. After all, these people were the wife of an enemy, and the mother of an enemy, and they were the children of an enemy, and your own children had a long education ahead of them. And one who concealed an enemy was also an enemy, and one who abetted an enemy was also an enemy, and one who continued his friendship with an enemy was also an enemy. and the telephone of the accursed family fell silent. And in the hustle of a big city, people felt as if they were in a desert. And that was precisely what Stalin needed. And he laughed in his mustaches, the shoeshine boy. In evaluating 1937 for the archipelago, we refused it the title of the crowning glory. But here, in talking about freedom, we have to grant it this corroded crown of betrayal. One has to admit that this was the particular year that broke the soul of our freedom, and opened it up to wide corruption on a mass scale. Yet even this was not yet the end of our society. As we see today, the end never did come. The living thread of Russia survived, hung on until the better times came in 1956, and it is now less than ever likely to die. The resistance was not overt. It did not beautify the epoch of the universal fall, but with its invisible warm veins its heart kept on beating, 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 beating. Every act of resistance to the government required heroism quite out of proportion to the magnitude of the act. It was safer to keep dynamite during the rule of Alexander II than it was to shelter the orphan of an enemy of the people under Stalin. Nonetheless, how many such children were taken in and saved? Let the children themselves tell their stories. And secret assistance to families did occur. And there was someone who took the place of an arrested person's wife who had been in a hopeless line for 3 days, so that she could go in and get warm and get some sleep. And there was also someone who went off with a pounding heart to warn someone else that an ambush was waiting for him at his apartment, and that he must not return there. And there was someone who gave a fugitive shelter, even though he himself did not sleep that night. Nowadays, it is quite convenient to declare that arrest was a lottery. Ehrenberg. Yes, it was a lottery, all right, but some of the numbers were fixed. They threw out a general dragnet and arrested in accordance with assigned quota figures, yes, but every person who objected publicly, they grabbed that very minute. And it was turned into a selection on the basis of soul, not a lottery. Those who were bold fell beneath the axe, were sent off to the archipelago, and the picture of the monotonously obedient freedom remained unruffled. All those who were purer and better could not stay in that society, and without them it kept getting more and more trashy. You would not notice these quiet departures at all, but they were, in fact, the dying soul of the people. 7. Corruption. In a situation of fear and betrayal over many years, people survive unharmed only in a superficial bodily sense, and inside, they become corrupt. So many millions of people agreed to become stool pigeons, and after all, if some 40 to 50 million people served long sentences in the archipelago during the course of the 35 years up to 1953, including those who died, and this is a modest estimate, being only 3 or 4 times the population of Gulag at any one time, and after all, during the war the death rate there was running 1% per day, then we can assume that at least every 3rd or at least every 5th case was the consequence of somebody's denunciation and that somebody was willing to provide evidence as a witness. All of them, all those murderers with ink, are still among us today. And most often they are prospering, and we still rejoice that they are our ordinary Soviet people. 8. The lie as a form of existence. Whether giving into fear or influenced by material self-interest or envy, people can't nonetheless become stupid so swiftly. Their souls may be thoroughly muddied, but they still have a sufficiently clear mind. They cannot believe that all the genius of the world has suddenly concentrated itself in on one head with a flattened, low-hanging forehead. They simply cannot believe the stupid and silly images of themselves which they hear over the radio, see in films, and read in the newspapers. Nothing forces them to speak the truth in reply, but no one allows them to keep silent. They have to talk. And what else but a lie? They have to applaud madly, and no one requires honesty of them. The permanent lie becomes the only safe form of existence, in the same way as betrayal. Every wag of the tongue can be overheard by someone, every facial expression observed by someone. Therefore, every word, if it does not have to be a direct lie, is nonetheless obliged not to contradict the general, common lie. There exists a collection of ready-made phrases, of labels, a selection of ready-made lies, and not one single speech, nor one single essay, or article, nor one single book, be it scientific, journalistic, critical, or literary, so-called, can exist without the use of these primary clichés. In the most scientific of texts, it is required that someone's false authority or false priority be upheld somewhere, and that someone be cursed for telling the truth. Without this lie, even an academic work cannot see the light of day. And what can be said about those shrill meetings and trashy lunch break gatherings where you are compelled to vote against your own opinion, to pretend to be glad over what distresses you? In prison, Tenno recalled with shame how 2 weeks before his own arrest he had lectured the sailors on the Stalinist Constitution, the most democratic in the world. And, of course, not one word of it was sincere. There is no man who has typed even 1 page without lying. There is no man who has spoken from a rostrum without lying. There is no man who has spoken into a microphone without lying. But only if it had all ended there. After all, it went further than that. Every conversation with the management, every conversation in the personnel section, every conversation of any kind with any other Soviet person called for lies. And if your idiot interlocutor said to you face to face that the Colorado beetles had been dropped on us by the Americans, it was necessary to agree, and a shake of the head instead of a nod might well cost you resettlement in the archipelago. Remember the arrest of Cholpanyov in Part 1, Chapter 7. But that was not all. Your children were growing up. And if the children were still little, then you had to decide what was the best way to bring them up, whether to start them off on lies instead of the truth, so that it would be easier for them to live, and then to lie forevermore in front of them too, or to tell them the truth, with the risk that they might make a slip, that they might let it out, which meant that you had to instill into them from the start that the truth was murderous, that beyond the threshold of the house you had to lie, only lie, just like Papa and Mama. The choice was really such that you would rather not have any children. 9. Cruelty. And where among all the preceding qualities was there any place left for kind-heartedness? How could one possibly preserve one's kindness while pushing away the hands of those who were drowning? Once you have become steeped in blood, you can only become more cruel. And, anyway, cruelty, class cruelty, was praised and instilled, and you would soon lose track, probably, of just where between bad and good that trait lay. And when you add that kindness was ridiculed, that pity was ridiculed, that mercy was ridiculed, you'd never be able to chain all those who were drunk on blood. 10. Slave psychology. In various parts of our country we find a certain piece of sculpture, a plaster guard with a police dog which is straining forward in order to sink its teeth into someone. In Tashkent there is one right in front of the NKVD school, and in Ryazan it is like a symbol of the city, the one and only monument to be seen if you approach from the direction of Mikhailikov, and we do not even shudder in revulsion. We have become accustomed to these figures setting dogs onto people as if they were the most natural things in the world. Setting the dogs onto us. End of Part 4.